Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to discuss some of the final chapters in the story of the third interstellar comet that visited the solar system, 3I Atlas. The comet that for the past few months has become one of the main stories in astronomy just because it was so unusual and so different from anything else we've seen so far. A treasure trove of data since its original discovery on July 1st, 2025. Just over a year ago from when I'm making this video. But in the last 2 months, specifically June and July of 2026, we actually had a flurry of additional scientific studies that once again fundamentally change our understanding of where this object potentially came from, and perhaps most importantly, what this object seems to tell us about our own place in the Milky Way. Because it turns out that mathematically and even chemically, this object is unlike anything we've seen so far, and does represent what's known as a galactic fossil of the Milky Way galaxy. And so let's discuss some of these discoveries and these updates in a bit more detail, but if you've missed some of the previous updates, you can also find additional videos in the description below. Over here, I guess let's do a very quick catch-up. Starting with the current location of this comet. Right now, as of July of 2026, it's moving extremely fast on the way out of the solar system, and is currently already past the orbit of Jupiter and past the orbit of Saturn. And because it's getting fainter and fainter, a lot of astronomers have been rushing to release their studies before this object completely disappears into darkness, not to be ever seen again. But I guess first, let's once again address the elephant in the room. Whenever there's some kind of a weird object in outer space, or some kind of a strange comet, there are always claims that this is maybe alien life. Or maybe this is just an artificial object coming to visit the solar system. But on June 3rd of 2026, SETI has officially established that there is nothing artificial about this by releasing a comprehensive report using the Allen telescope array that scanned this comet for several hours, looking for any possible radio signal or unusual emission that might indicate artificial origins. And the result is, well, nothing. Nothing was found. All detected signals were traced back to human satellites or Earth-based interference, and all radio signals produced by the comet were produced by different types of gas, with most signals coming from the hydroxyl radicals as a result of the water molecule vaporized by the sunlight. But even though this is not an alien spaceship, its natural origin seems to be even more intriguing, because it seems to have come from the dawn of the galaxy, with the most significant discoveries in the last few weeks involving the comet's very bizarre chemistry and very strange isotopes. And here we have at least 2 major papers you can find in the description that were published in Nature and Nature Astronomy, with both of them focusing on the isotopes and the gas trailing behind the comet. And I guess let's start with the isotopes. In case you forgot chemistry, isotopes are just different versions of the same element, because inside they contain different number of neutrons. And the most famous isotope of them all is of course carbon. Now most of the galaxy contains carbon-12, but stars can also slowly produce carbon-13 over time. And so in this recent study led by Martin Cordiner and Cyrielle Opitom, researchers found that 3I Atlas has an unusually low amount of carbon-13 and extremely high ratio of nitrogen-14 to nitrogen-15. Or, in simple words, it essentially implies that the star system this came from was extremely ancient, much older than the solar system, and very likely by billions of years. With the isotopic analysis now estimating that this comet is possibly up to 12 billion years old, or 7.5 billion years older than the solar system, and very likely formed during the so-called cosmic noon, the period in the universe where the universe was basically at its brightest and was actually creating the most stars. This was about 2 to 3 billion years following the Big Bang, and was the absolute peak of star formation in the universe. But at this time most stars were forming from somewhat primitive material, and were predominantly made out of hydrogen and helium, and did not contain a lot of metals. But it looks like during this time, at least one star somewhere out there also created a tiny comet. A comet that's now been traveling for these 12 billion years, and for the first time in its history, encountered a new star, our Sun. But here things do get just a little bit stranger. And that's because additional observations from ALMA, the telescope in Chile, reveal that 3I Atlas also contains 30 times more deuterium or heavy water compared to the rest of the solar system. And in astronomy, this ratio usually acts as a kind of a cosmic thermometer. And that's because heavy water usually forms in extremely cold conditions and does not like to form close to the star, which suggests that 3I Atlas formed in a part of the galaxy that was extremely frigid and most likely below 30 Kelvin, minus 240 Celsius, or minus 406 Fahrenheit. In contrast, our Sun formed in a very crowded and relatively warm nebula, which is why the hydrogen isotopes in the solar system are so different. But looks like for this comet, its home system possibly formed in a very lonely, isolated, and relatively quiet corner of the ancient Milky Way that maybe did not contain a lot of partners, and for some reason was extremely cold, with the additional analysis of the carbon isotopes confirming that the comet formed from the material that was not heavily enriched by generations of stars and seems to contain pristine chemicals, pointing at the origin in a very young galaxy inside extremely chemically primitive region of space. Something that we actually usually observe with telescopes like the James Webb when it observes distant galaxies at the edge of the universe. But the intriguing part about this comet is that this is literally a time capsule. Unlike the solar system comets that usually interact with the Sun once in a while and do go through various chemical changes, it looks like 3I Atlas remained mostly frozen in time and has not changed until it started to approach the Sun. And so this is our first unique opportunity to study the history and the chemical evolution of the Milky Way galaxy. Although its precise location and its precise origin is still going to be more or less impossible to trace because of relatively complex galactic dynamics. But based on the analysis of silicates in the coma of this comet, here scientists also now think that it most likely formed very far from the parent star. In other words, there are signs that this comet formed in a very calm environment on the outskirts of its parent star system, which means that our Sun is literally the first star this comet interacted with, and all of the material that was released is essentially pristine and billions of years old. Most of it was actually enclosed inside the comet for this whole time. And here just a quick reminder from previous videos on what we think this comet was like in terms of the structure. This was based on a very unexpected discovery of methane that suddenly started coming from inside the comet once the comet passed the Sun and started to move close to Jupiter. And so this very unusual delay and the sudden release of lots of different stuff from inside the comet essentially suggests that the comet was covered in this relatively hard baked crust resembling a kind of a protective shell. So kind of like a chocolate-covered peanut. But in this case, this chocolate was basically baked by the cosmic radiation for something like 12 billion years. In other words, it contained this relatively unusual layer because it continuously traveled the galaxy and was constantly bombarded by radiation that created this layer that's at least 10 meters deep. We actually sort of see something very similar, but on a much smaller scale, in some of the objects in the Kuiper belt very far away from the Sun. And while it took the intense radiation from the Sun to finally crack the shell open and to finally reveal the fresh, icy interior. Which is why these pristine materials suddenly started to come out and started to be released in huge amounts. And in this case, by discovering methane and even methanol, which were actually found in huge amounts, is also a very important sign for a lot of astrobiological studies. And that's because both methane and methanol are what's known as prebiotic molecules, building blocks needed for life that were now also discovered in this ancient object, which seems to contain the recipe for life, even though it's been floating around the galaxy for nearly 12 billion years. And so, what is the big takeaway from the last few months of studying this comet? Well, so far, 3I Atlas taught us that our solar system might actually be the weird one. And that is important because most of our models today, especially models involving stars and planets, are based on what we see right here in the solar system inside our home. But this comet suggests that star systems can and do form in much colder, quieter environments and do contain very different chemical ratios. And so if this comet represents a sample of ancient stars that we never considered before, then this means that we're looking at the universe that's a lot more diverse than we ever imagined and ever thought. And that means that some of the models will have to change with time. And so because of its unique elemental composition and its very strange properties, we can now assume that a lot of different objects out there, and especially a lot of star systems, are potentially extremely different from our own and possibly develop in a slightly different way. But as this comet drifts past Saturn and eventually exits the solar system, we'll probably still be getting new studies because even right now, astronomers are trying to sift through all of the data in order to understand exactly what we just witnessed and exactly what this means for astronomy as a whole. And so even though we already discovered so many surprises, and it only took approximately 1 year, chances are that in the next few months, our entire perspective on other star systems and the evolution of the Milky Way might once again change completely. And that's because, for now at least, we can confidently say that we kind of touched a piece of the ancient Milky Way galaxy. A visitor from the very beginning of our galactic history, basically making this one of the biggest discoveries in astronomy in the last decade. But on that note, once we have some additional discoveries or something else surprising, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.